I think we should reset to begin. Before we start, good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's having a nice evening. One thing I should explain, just so if anyone has any technical difficulties, please use the chat function and just post a message in the chat. I will read it and we'll try to solve it if you have any technical issues. If we can't resolve it, we'll be posting this meeting as well as all of our other previous meetings on our YouTube channel as well. Just so in case you miss anything, you'll still be able to catch up. Just please use the chat function in case there's any technical difficulties. Yeah, hope everyone's having a nice meeting. My name is Andre. Welcome to this lecture. And I'll be introducing Chris Price today, who's going to be this month's lecture speaker. Chris is the archivist for the Antique Motorcycle Club of America, and he's also the author of Georgia Motorcycle History, and as well as the founder of archivemoto.com. Archivemoto.com is an ongoing research and publishing project dedicated to American motorcycling heritage, particularly vintage motorcycles. You can also find his excellent YouTube channel by the same name as well, archivemoto.com. We'll be talking tonight about the early days of U.S. Motorcycle racing, particularly giving attention to Glenn Curtis. Thank you so much for putting this presentation together, Chris. I'm really excited to hear more about motorcycle history. It's something that I don't know too much about.
Oh, well, buckle up because I get going and I don't stop talking, apparently. At least that's what my wife says. So I guess I'll start by just saying thank you to everyone who's joining in. Special thanks to Andre and the Curtis Museum for inviting me to come talk about the stuff that I really enjoy talking about. Real quick, just off the bat, I live in Tennessee, so it's a little bit earlier for me. But by day, I am a high school history teacher, surrounded by 14 and 15-year-olds who berate me and emasculate me at any given opportunity. And then when I come home, I have 4 kids who continue to berate and emasculate me at any given opportunity. In any free time that I may muster, I kind of dig into the origins of American motorcycle culture. It's something that, I don't know, started captivating me as I was seeing motorcycles and not really knowing what they were. Kind of the same, I'd say, mechanism that you might have if you go to a car show and you see a 57 Chevy, but you don't know it's a 57 Chevy. I knew there's things called knuckleheads, but I didn't really know what a knucklehead was. And as I started to learn more and dig through internet forums and look at pictures online, I started becoming more and more fascinated by the really early days and how all of this stuff got started. So for tonight, we're going to kind of pick up where the last lecture series guest, Lauren Shields, he went through a history of the bicycle, and as it so happens, the motorcycle just kind of springs out of the very vibrant and thriving bicycle culture of the late 1800s. So to get started, in my free time, I do run a website. You're more than welcome to check it out if you hear anything here that you enjoy. I post articles on the website, and I also have a newer YouTube channel where I try to condense my ramblings into little bite-sized pieces of important aspects of early American motorcycle culture. The people like Glenn Curtis who helped kind of invent the machines themselves, to the races and the different motorcycles of note throughout, I would say, a range between 1900 and around 1950. So to kick things off, I'll just read this because it'll get me going. In the beginning, when there were only but a few motorcycles in existence, the spirit of competition already held a firm grip on the budding culture. As the old adage goes, the first race took place as soon as the second motorcycle was built. So, for tonight, we are going to start with the earliest expressions of what would become the motorcycle industry at the turn of the 20th century. Um, it is a culture and an industry deeply rooted in the bicycling craze of the late 1800s. Then we're going to take a look at the first class, the pioneers, people like Glenn Curtis and Oscar Hedstrom, that really drove innovation forward, tinkering in their garages and their workshops, trying to figure out how they could get an engine onto a bicycle for the purposes of racing initially, and then how that built into civilian roadster machines. We'll look at the competition evolution between, say, 1903 and 1910, how the industry of motorcycle racing really got a hold on the country. And then we'll break off and look at Glenn Curtis himself. I figured it was only appropriate to really draw an emphasis on his contributions, how he fared in the sport and in the industry, given that among the kind of ubiquitous Harley Davidsons and Indian motorcycles, even some more obscure early brands like Excelsior, Reading Standard, or Thor, for instance, Curtis really moved the whole project of the motorcycle along at a pace unlike anyone else in his kind of group at the very beginning. Yet, because of his accomplishments in aviation later in life, Curtis kind of gets overlooked as one of the founding fathers of this culture. Um, if I can restrain myself and we don't run out of time, I hope to hit the kind of beginnings of the first golden age of motorcycle racing. This is the age of the infamous board track motordromes. And then the kind of quiet ending to the Curtis motorcycle brand as Glenn Curtis kind of dove further into his career in aviation. So, to get started, we are looking at the weirdest machines you can think of, but the early bicycles, as odd as they may have been, were nothing short of a revolution. 1860s, 1870s, coming out of England, based around Europe, we see the crude forms of this new transportation method taking shape. Initially, they were called velocipedes or bone shakers. I've heard them referred to as dandy horses, ordinaries, penny farthings, whatever you want to call them. These machines took the world and made it more accessible for more people. Initially, they were, as any kind of new technology tends to go, they were the just toys of the more elite in society. But given that there wasn't a lot holding them back in terms of the production cost, the bicycle started to offer businesses a new means of transportation, with couriering, with being able to cover longer distances in shorter amounts of time. But it more importantly offered regular people a new form of A, transportation, and B, recreation. Clubs formed around bicycles, and soon enough, we started seeing the beginnings of a racing scene within bicycles. It was in around 1876 at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia that the high wheel bicycles on display really kind of captivated the American culture and the American consumer. And it was a venture that was capitalized on by a gentleman named Colonel Albert Pope. He immediately saw the potential in bicycles and the interest that it sparked in people, and wound up securing a license to construct and produce and start selling these high wheel bicycles in the United States. His brand was named Columbia, and Pope would be kind of the godfather of a lot of aspects of not just bicycle culture, but motorcycle culture and automobile culture through his campaigning for better roads, to his kind of development of higher level finishes and quality motorcycles well into cars and things like that. It was in 1878 at Boston's Beacon Park that the first bicycle race took place, and shortly thereafter, again, Colonel Pope founded the League of American Wheelmen in 1880. Pope, along with people like George Hendy, Jack Prince, who was a British high wheel bicycle champion, really took this idea of the bicycle as a sport um, and scaled it throughout America. Jack Prince became a promoter of races. Then he became a builder of tracks. You can see the images here. We have, excuse me, we have an outdoor venue. This would have been a driving track or a like a horse track. Essentially, lots of towns already had those in place. But Prince brought with him these banked wooden velodrome tracks, which became quite popular and suited the kind of crude nature of these machines early on. Um, it was when John Kemp Starley kind of innovated further on the bicycle's design, making that ridiculous giant wheel the same size and making a geometry that was more applicable to the everyday cyclist, that the machines really took off. That, along with the development of pneumatic rubber tires by Dunlop, John Dunlop, that made the bicycle no longer this specialty item, but this kind of not necessity, but something that everyone could really access at that time. So, with the access came popularity. With the popularity came the idea that these races were very exciting. Kids could ride a bike and they could also go see someone ride a bike really fast. And the idea of racing became a very popular sport, and it started to scale from there. It started to expand into a team sport. If you notice here on the upper right, we have some gentlemen with some tandem bicycles. At least a couple of them have tandem bicycles. And the idea of a team where a group of tandem riders would go in front of the racing star soon became the most popular form of the sport, especially on these kind of smooth wooden velodromes. You can see Jack Prince there underneath, kind of demonstrating how the banked walls of these 2x4s would allow for higher speeds in a more condensed oval type shape. These could also be built indoors to protect them from weather. And so the sport in and of itself exploded. The industry attached to it exploded, and you started seeing a lot of people turning towards um, machine work, developing their own components, and building small businesses that turned into large businesses, either making components for bikes, catering to the racing aspect of it, or making full-on bicycle companies all their own. These tandem bicycles would create essentially a slipstream in front of the star where they would circle the track until towards the end of the race, and the tandem team would drop off, allowing the stars to sprint to the end, thus having maintained a lot of their energy throughout. So the tandems, they started getting a bit ridiculous. As you can see, we're getting more people because more people mean more power. We can get higher speeds more efficiently. And we started seeing bicycle teams become not only a crowded affair, but an expensive affair because the prize money had to be divided up among these people. The different bicycle companies who were kind of capitalizing on success were shelling out salaries, and the industry itself started to get quite bloated, um, with the idea of these teams on the ever expanding scale of how many people can you get onto a bicycle. I am not kidding when it got ridiculous. So the idea was at this time propulsion, and propulsion had a few variants to it. Initially, we had already, as a species dealt with steam power, and so steam presented an option to build one of these pacing machines to not require so many men or pockets to put coins into. And so steam became kind of a front runner as a propulsion device that we maybe could affix to these tandem pacers. But so too, around the same time, late 1800s still, um, we saw experiments, early experiments with electric pacing machines. If you notice here, we have what's called the Stanley steamer. Um, the steamer was cumbersome, complex, had to heat up, quite dangerous. Sylvester Roper, seen with his solo steam-powered motorcycle, actually met his demise on that contraption. But on the lower left, we have a French cycling team, the Jaloux brothers, who were pioneers in the space of an electric pacing machine. It was the Jaloux brothers who would come to the United States um, in order to try and develop their own electric pacing company with the help of Charles Metz, who was building bicycles and very active in the Northeastern cycle racing circuit. But it was the finicky nature of electrics plus the weight of the battery technology they had at the time that really kind of limited the electric version of a tandem pacing cycle from taking off. That's when we meet the kind of progenitor of gasoline internal combustion engines. Um, the Dion Bouton is kind of our touch point. This is where we're going to cross a threshold. It is a internal combustion engine made around the same time as we see Benz and Daimler working on their gasoline internal combustion engines in the late 1800s. Um, Let me see if I remember his name because I forgot to put it on the slide. Marquis Jules Albert de Dion. Okay. You have to forgive me for all the mispronunciations of French words. But it was in 1883 that de Dion in France started powering some vehicles with steam, but he saw the potential of an internal combustion engine and started working along with an engineer, Georges Bouton, in 1895 to try and develop a gasoline-powered internal combustion engine to power his multi-wheeled vehicles. At this point in time, tricycles and four-wheeled buggies of a sort were the initial approach of the technology that de Dion was working on. In 1897, he began production of his tricycle, the de Dion Bouton Trike, which became one of the most popular vehicles at the turn of the century. I think in France, he was producing around 50,000 of these things. But it was, I think, evident to people of a two-wheeled persuasion that perhaps this engine could be the answer to the weight of battery technology or the cumbersome nature of steam in order to power their tandem pacers. The obvious solution is shoehorn one of these into a tandem bicycle, and now you have a motorized tandem pacing machine. Now, this one comes from Orient. We'll talk about them in just a second, but you can see just from the configuration here, you would have two drivers, it's kind of a minimum. The front driver would be in charge of steering the bicycle. The rear driver, also known as a stayer, he would somewhat block the wind, but he would also operate the engine. Very crude at this point in time. It's not just a turn it on and go. Fuel air mixtures, carburetors were not great. Electrics, ignitions were not great. So quite an ordeal to keep everything running as it should be. And then you have the sprinter there at the back. That would be the cycling star of the day. So it is in 1898, December, that Jack Prince had erected this grand velodrome inside Madison Square Garden in New York, and they were holding a 6-day racing event. This was a massive event. You can see all the banners touting the different brands that are sponsoring this event. There was a lot of money on the line for the men that were riding. There was a lot of money on the line for the companies that were sponsoring the riders, building the bikes and selling the accessories. So in December 1898, a French cycling star who had been working with de Dion by the name of Henri Fournier, along with his riding partner Gaston Ricard, brought 3 of these de Dions over to America. It was a marked event. They advertised that these new French infernal machines, as they were referred to in the press, were going to be on display. They would be doing some exhibition runs. And the idea that it captivated the crowd there is an understatement. Um, you have bicycles and they can make a little bit of racket, and you have a crowd and they can make a lot of a racket. But a motorcycle, especially at this stage, is almost violent in what it can evoke viscerally from a person's observation of it. It's got a smell to it. It billows smoke and it is popping and loud and crackling. And as it gets going around the velodrome, the amount of speed that they are able to do without exerting any effort becomes a sensation in America. It is at this event that a young French Canadian man, I think he was around 18 or 19 at the time, named Jacob de Rozier, he inquired as Fournier was unloading his 3 de Dion machines on the docks as to whether or not he had someone to steer the tandem version. The 3 versions that Fournier brought over were a single rider, a tandem pacing machine, and one of the trikes, the very popular trikes. Well, DeRozier and Fournier, for whatever reason, hit it off, and Fournier said that he could act as the steerer on his tandem machine. And that kicked off a career for Jacob DeRozier, who would eventually become the very first professional motorcycle racer in America and led one of the most storied lives that I've ever encountered in researching this history. But there was a gentleman by the name of Kenneth Skinner. He was a British-born mechanic living in Boston, where he built bicycles and worked on bicycles at the Back Bay Cycle Company. Um, Skinner was able to acquire a license to distribute the De Dion engines here in the United States because he worked at the De Dion factory for about a year before coming here. And he was tuned into the cycling scene in the Northeast. He was friends with a gentleman named Charles Henshaw, who also raced with a gentleman named Oscar Hedstrom, later of Indian fame. He knew the major players, and once everybody saw this internal combustion tandem pacing machine for the first time, they thought they could probably put something like that together for themselves. So Skinner starts to bring in a few de Dions, and a few interested parties start to acquire them, tinker with them, see how they work, see what they might could do with them. And a gentleman named Charles Metz of the Waltham Manufacturing Company was the second in line to get distribution rights. Now, Metz was a avid cyclist, former champion. He was also, excuse me, he was also the owner of the Waltham Manufacturing Company, producing the Orient line of bicycles, a very popular bicycle in the late 1800s. And his vision was to find a way to make his own Orient pacing machines. He had worked with the Jalou brothers on a kind of rough result electric tandem pacer when they had come the previous year. But it was Metz who was able to take the idea of putting one of these engines into a bicycle frame and a tandem frame that would kind of establish the motorcycle industry at the very beginning. So here is Charles Henshaw and Oscar Hedstrom. We'll talk about them in a second. This is on Hedstrom's own developed, what's known as the Typhoon pacing machine. But as you can see, these are getting a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more elegant as these pioneer inventors in America start to get their hands on the technology and work their vision for how they should operate. So that brings us to the first class. Now, I'll just go ahead and take a break to say, um, in my high school classes, I usually get through about 8 slides a day during our lessons, and those lessons are usually about 45 minutes long. I was told that I have about 50 minutes, and maybe we'll open up for some questions at the end. Um, I have 50 slides to get through, so we'll see how well I do. But the first class is what I consider to be the gentlemen, the entrepreneurs, the tinkerers, the machinists, and more importantly, the guys that were deeply already embedded in the cycling industry in America, um, how they formed this new industry and how they invented this new machine known as a motorcycle. As soon as one guy had his version of a motorcycle, we're going to see that the others couldn't resist but jump into the pot and see whose is better, whose can go faster, and hopefully whose can sell more. So, first off, we have Charles Herman Metz. He established his business in Waltham, Massachusetts. He was an early high wheel racer and sold Columbia bicycles in Utica, New York. He formed the Waltham Manufacturing Company in 1886 to produce bicycle components. And then, once the safety designs had been established in America, he started building his own, branded as the Orient line. Like I said before, he tried to develop an electric tandem pacer with the Jalou brothers in 1898. The experiment didn't go so well, but then Fournier was hot on the heels with his de Dion powered machines at the 6 Days at Madison Square Garden. So then he secured distribution rights for de Dion Baton engines and started to build his own vision of what a motorcycle would be. It's also Metz who is credited with coining the term motorcycle, as at this point, everybody's branding everything in all kinds of ways. And we have motocycle in the case of Indian. There was a real goofy one. It skips my mind. Maybe I'll think of it in a minute. Um, yeah, but the motorcycle, as it would come to be known, um, debuted in 1900, towards the end, and just a couple of months before our next pioneer released his own version. But Metz deemed his the Orient. The Orient cycle can be seen here. It is kind of an awkward stance. It is very short framed. That is not a significant amount of power in between the rider's shins there, but it is enough to get the job done. And it is very hot and blowing up combustible gases the entire time. The guy on the left here is goes by the name of Ralph Hamlin. He became the first West Coast dealer of Orient machines. They were configured either with the de Dion engine or a clone brand out of France known as Aster. The two images that you can see here are Aster powered. You can tell that by the copper flanged washers going across the cylinder there to aid in cooling. We'll talk about Hamlin more in just a second. Next on deck of our first class is Edwin Ross Thomas, usually referred to as E.R. Thomas. He established his business in Buffalo, New York. He was also an early high wheel racer, selling Columbia. Oop, nope. I'm sorry. Yep, that's a typo. He wasn't. Um, but Thomas began with clip-on engine kits, known as the auto buy, and these kits became available for anyone to buy an engine and try to retrofit it to their own machine, their own bicycle, or take components that Thomas would make available to build up their own motorcycles. By 1903, Thomas had become the largest engine manufacturer in America. And like many pioneer brands, Glenn Curtiss began his experiments in motorcycles using Thomas engines. This is the Thomas Autobuy that would have come out fully complete as a complete rolling motorcycle around 1901. And though I do believe there were advertisements in 1900, there's a debate, I think, and maybe I'm just not informed enough to know the solution to the debate as to whether it was Metz or Thomas that came first to the market. From what I've read, it seems like Metz beat him by just a couple of months, but Thomas was definitely a prolific engine builder, and these kits kind of started a lot of companies along the way. 1901, we run into Carl Oscar Hedstrom. He's from Middletown, Connecticut, as well as a workshop in Springfield, Massachusetts, once Indian gets started. But his family immigrated from Sweden in 1880 when he was a young boy, and as a teenager, he became a tool maker and a mechanic. He was embedded in the cycling scene in the Northeast and was well known as a champion of that racing circuit. And he grew fascinated with the motor tandems. He was a pacing racer. He used those tandem bicycles. He would drive those tandem bicycles in races, and he became fascinated once he saw Fournier and the de Dion by what could be done if he could get his hands on a motor. He did get his hands on a de Dion motor by way of Charles Henshaw, who was connected with Skinner back in Boston, and he started to tinker with it. He wanted to see A, how it worked, and B, how he could make it better, more efficient, maybe more powerful. His very first experiment is known as the Royal Blue Express, a motor tandem that he built in 1899. But then he refined his design in 1900 and built four of what we know as the Typhoon pacing machine. He then was then at the Madison Square Garden 6-day races in 1901. He crossed paths with George Hendy, another former cycle champion who had built up, based on his successes in the industry, a thriving business making bicycles under the Silver King and Silver Queen line. And at those races, the two gentlemen agreed that they probably could come up with both the capital required to start a new motorcycle company, but the engineering it demanded to come up with the best available motorcycle on the market. These two pictures come from the prototypes of that first Indian motorcycle. Hindi and Hedstrom joined forces, and by May, they met in January. By May, Hedstrom had completed the first Indian motorcycle. Um, I think it's worth pausing here to say that Hedstrom, in my view, was unique in his ability to imbue elegance into his engineering. Um, he was dedicated to speed and he was dedicated to sussing out the best possible way to engineer his machines. But whatever it was with his eye or his approach, his machines always came across in a very graceful, simplistic, but utilitarian at the same time way. One of my favorite pictures is of Hedstrom here on the right. You can see him in his workshop at the Worcester. I'm not going to say that right either. I'm from the South, sorry. Cycle manufacturing company where he worked prior. And my favorite part about this is you get a straight-on view of the very first Indian motorcycle prototype as he is building it, still in raw metal, but it's the shadow that you can kind of see the silhouette of the lines that he was developing. So We'll move on to 1902 with Joseph Merkel. Merkel was based out of Milwaukee. He was a machinist and engineer who began manufacturing bicycle components in 1899. He tested his first motorcycle design in 1900. And by 1902, he was in full-fledged production. Now, this predates the other Milwaukee manufacturer we might all know, which is Harley-Davidson. And it is also worth noting that the early Merkel and the early Harley-Davidson sure do share a lot of similarities. Merkel makes my list of this first class because he pioneers a lot of novel technology at the time. He looks for lighter weights. He looks to re-engineer not a diamond bicycle frame, but build a bespoke motorcycle frame, a loop frame to cradle the engine. He works with not swingers, but swing arms and sprung forks adapted from the Sager company out of New York. And it's Merkel that is consistently pushing the envelope of what is effective in a motorcycle, along with pursuing racing excellence as the sport of motorcycle racing starts to take shape. These are some early examples of his first machines. As you can see, the loop frame cradles the cases of the engines there. They also incorporated springs into the rear section and the front section. He, along with Glenn Curtis, were some of the first to use ball bearings on the internals to help aid rotational mass and make more efficient power. But Joseph Merkel will be kind of an ambassador to the racing industry for the next decade. Last but not least, the man of the hour, Glenn Hammond Curtis. I am not going to pretend to do an entire biography here. I'm assuming some of you may already know more than I do. But in Hammondsport, New York, he starts his business. He's an avid sportsman, a bicycle racing champion by 1897, and working as a courier or messenger in bicycle shops. In 1898, he opens his own bicycle shop in Hammondsport and another in Bath, New York, and develops designs and builds his own brand of bicycles that he names Hercules. He experimented with Thomas engines early on in 1899, building his first motorcycle in 1900 with the help of his uncle, Frank Neff, who was a talented machinist. And it is that spirit, I think, that all of these men within the first class share this idea that this is too interesting to leave on the table. And if we have to build it ourselves, maybe we can build it the best way possible. In 1902, he introduces his first Hercules motorcycle with his own engine design. And then in 1903, he became the first to build an American V-twin, again under the name of Hercules. The thing that I think Curtis brings to the table at this point in history is the fact that he is a small operation, yet he is able to jump the line to the very top of the industry and help pull the other kind of founding fathers of motorcycles along with his dedication to innovation and his passion for building it the best way possible. Oops, skipped over one there. So there's Curtis on the left. He's in the center with a single cylinder Hercules, and then an image of him with his V twin. Um, so other notable brands between 1900 and 1901, that's really when this whole thing kind of cracks open. We see an explosion of bicycle manufacturers, many of which were built on the back of an already successful industry in the cycling craze. And we see names like Orient, Holly, Thomas, Marsh, Thor, Keating, Mitchell, and Indian among them. So, how do we get from bicycles to pacing machines to engines to racing? It is a natural progression over the course of maybe 2 years at most, where these guys are so dedicated to the idea of I think it would be really cool to put one of these engines onto like a single rider roadster machine. And as soon as they crack that open, it's time to see who's faster. So in 1901, May 7th, Ralph Hamlin from Los Angeles, the first Orient dealer on the West Coast, he, in an effort to promote his business, which will be a common theme in the rise of the racing sport, decides to stage a race at Agriculture Park. It's a horse track. And this becomes what we credit as the first organized motorcycle race in American history. Hamlin on his Astra-powered Orient beats three other motorcycles and hits an average speed of 32 miles per hour, both proving that the machines themselves are capable. They're not too cumbersome to operate, but they also are going to open up a person's available world by miles. Prior to this, prior to the bicycle, you could get on a train if you could afford the ticket, or you could ride a horse if you could afford to feed it, or you could walk. And that was the extent of your options. And that's why the bicycle and then soon thereafter the motorcycle became this kind of revolutionary cultural corner that we turned. The driving clubs, like Agriculture Park, then became kind of the cradle for this early sport of racing. Most towns already had horse tracks. They were usually manicured dirt or sand, and they allowed for a motorcycle or a group of motorcycles to really open up their machines and see who was, in fact, the fastest. The driving clubs would become kind of a staple for all of racing history, because again, every town seemed to have a horse trotting track at the very least. So as amateur clubs started taking hold, they would organize events and meets at these driving clubs. Also found in most towns around the United States are some hills, and hill climbing was a popular aspect of kind of a niche within cycling. And the hill climb presented a trial for motorcycles. If your motorcycle was powerful enough, it had the right gearing to make it up the steepest grade in town, well, then you could plaster that on an advertisement and hopefully sell more of your machines. So by 1902, we start to see organized hill climbs, initially as exhibitions alongside some of these cycling events. But then as it goes, the same thing that happened with the velodromes, the motorcycles are a bit more exciting than the bicycle races, and people wanted to start seeing more motorcycles competing against motorcycles themselves. A lot of these events would start with the New York Motorcycle Club. They become like Agriculture Park in Los Angeles. The New York Motorcycle Club becomes kind of the um, main organizing body for a lot of the earliest motorcycle events in America. The hill climbs would typically just be time trials. Whoever is fastest to the top is going to get the medal or the prize money or at least the accolades. And they started getting swamped with people that were just interested in seeing these new machines go 30, 40 miles an hour up these hills. Then we find land speed. It's one thing to be fast on a track, it's another to be fast up a hill, but how fast can you go flat out? It is at Ormond Beach in 1903 that an event is organized to have kind of the Gilded Age elites, the guys that had cars in America already, come down to the hard packed wide sands just north of Daytona and wind out their cars. See who could go the fastest. If you had a prototype that you had been working on, bring it down and let's see how fast you really are. This is akin to the Bonneville Salt Flats. It's just enough space to be able to really wind out your machine. Um, it's there in March 1903 that Oscar Hedstrom decides to come down. He's the only motorcycle entrant, yeah, at this very first Carnival of Speed, and he has built a special machine for the occasion. Using one of his Typhoon Pacers, he builds a new frame, shortens things up, and makes a bespoke speed machine. He is able to hit, I forget, 53, 57 miles per hour on the sands and establishes a new American mile record in the process. This is going to be a consistent theme with Hedstrom that his accomplishments with speed and racing are going to convert directly into sales of the Indian brand, making them the most dominant brand right out of the gate. When Harley Davidson is building three machines, Indian is building 2,000. So Hedstrom's drive to be the fastest, to make the fastest machine, is what put Indian on the map to be the most dominant motorcycle manufacturer up until the 1920s, arguably, but well through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when they met their ultimate demise. Perhaps one of the most popular forms of the sport was endurance and reliability. These started around 1903. Again, the New York Motorcycle Club started organizing these different events, and the scope of them got larger and larger. We went from a 5 mile race around a horse track to a 150 mile endurance competition to see, okay, you've built a fast motorcycle, but is it fast for 5 minutes or is it fast for an hour? Um, these really appealed to the manufacturers themselves because they could field a team and the team does well. That only proves that they have the best machine on the market, and the advertisements would reflect any victories therein. This first was organized under the auspices of a brand new organization known as the Federation of American Motorcyclists, who kind of sprung out of the New York Motorcycle Club as the sanctioning body. They would promote road campaigns, they would organize races, they would procure timing mechanisms to make sure everything is above board. And then they would go town to town promoting the um, formation of motorcycle clubs, which only helped to grow the culture. This very first event, Glenn Curtis happens to be there on board his brand new V-twin machine, though he did not do quite as well as he had hoped. It was a thirsty machine, according to the early articles. George Holden here on an Indian, what is known as the Indian Camelback, those first very distinctive models, won the event. So Glenn Curtis enters on this new 5 horsepower Hercules V-twin. It was quite powerful. It was almost triple the horsepower of most of the other entrants, and he leads the race for the first 5 miles. But he is forced to retire with mechanical difficulties on the seventh mile. George Holden, on his modified 1 3/4 horsepower single, won the event with an average speed of 37.5 miles per hour. It's this moment, though, Curtis's development of this V-twin, that really cracks open the drive of other manufacturers, namely Oscar Hedstrom, to up their game and propel the industry forward at a very fast pace. So, as an offshoot of the New York Motorcycle Club, the Federation of American Motorcycles was founded, and the culture from 1903 on simply explodes. Clubs are popping up around the country. Dealers are able to move motorcycles because the newspapers are reporting on the races and on the endurance events, things like George Wyman's cross country, the first man to go coast to coast under the power of a motor. The culture, the industry, and the sport all condense in 1903. And from there on, it's just magnetic. So, we are pushing up on time. I'm going to go quickly through these last few. And if anyone is interested in some questions towards the end, I'll be happy to try my best to answer them. But I wanted to draw a little bit of attention onto Curtis himself. So he began racing his brand new 2.5 horsepower Hercules single on September 1st, 1902, at a 10-mile race in Brooklyn, New York. Of the 17 people, there were Orients, Thomas, Autobys, Merkles, and Indians. George Holden on an Indian um, won the event, followed by Hugo Bendix on an imported telecom single. Curtis finished third, but he did so because he took a tumble and cracked his frame. Only the motor mounts held his machine together, and he still managed to run 38 miles per hour to finish the race in third. Um, Curtis used that moment to begin running advertisements for his new machine, releasing them the next year. May 30th, 1903, he debuts his 5 horsepower Hercules V twin. Again, a kind of benchmark in the history in the industry at that moment. He hits a top speed of 35 miles per hour. And though multi-engine twins had made a brief appearance with the tandems being two engines kind of like attached together, his new idea of boiling it down into a V twin is what opened up the industry to think that we can have capable machines with accessible power that aren't clunky or cumbersome. He followed his performance in September at the Manhattan Beach 150-mile race. Like I said, leading the first 5 miles, but being forced to retire in the seventh. Then for the Carnival of Speed, 1904, Curtis joined Oscar Hedstrom with his twin. Now, Hedstrom was well aware of his twin and decided to try and cobble together a twin of his own. If you see the picture on the left, that's Hedstrom. It's the same Typhoon Pacer, only instead of one engine, he's actually mounted two side by side, joined at the pin. It worked, but it didn't work great. And it certainly didn't work as well as Curtis's V twin. With the Hercules, Curtis basically decimated Hedstrom, and Hedstrom tucked his tail between his legs after having been the darling of the Carnival of Speed the year prior, went back to his workshop and began working on his own new V twin. Um, Curtis's Hercules broke every speed record from 2 to 10 miles and inspired Hedstrom to develop his own. Within, I think, 6 months, in May 1904, the first Indian V twin prototype was built, and Hedstrom began running it at northeastern hill climbs and races, further developing until the first official Indian V twin was released in, I believe, '07. So I am going to skip ahead a bit because once we get to 1905, 1906, Curtis is still very active within the racing world, but the racing world is starting to balloon. It's starting to expand with a flurry of new brands, very capable machines, and Curtis's eye is starting to be drawn towards aviation. In the first 5 years, by 1906, brands like Curtis had been joined by innovative newcomers like Harley-Davidson, Reading Standard, California Yale, Cleveland, and Wagner, among dozens of others, but it was Indian that was still at the top. I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, so I will hit Ormond in '07 when to test a V8 powered dirigible, we'll say that, engine. He built a special frame and went back to Ormond to really wind it out. The 4-mile course was divided. The first 2 miles would be to gain speed, the third mile to record the top speed, and the fourth to hopefully slow down and stop. And it was there in 1907, January 1907, that Curtis hit a record 136.3 miles per hour. It was an unofficial record, however, because to make his official run, he would have to run again on the return, and he had snapped the universal joint and torqued his frame. Nonetheless, this became a sensation in the newspapers and all the trade magazines, touting the fastest man on earth, and again, kind of elevating Curtis's visibility within the industry um, as he turned his eye towards aviation. He continued to race in 1907, picking up a few wins and a few medals along the way, also setting a new speed record in Providence, Rhode Island at the FAM hill climb, hitting a record speed of 64 miles per hour. But on his final run, he overshot the finish line and took a tumble. This one gave him a pretty nasty knee injury and some lacerations. So he decided he would probably hang up his racing jobbers. Actually, I believe it was his wife that made that decision for him. Though against his wife's wishes, in 1908 at Fort George, he once again raced, knocking out a couple of top spots. His focus by 1908, though, had transcended motorcycles into aviation. And the last of the Curtis motorcycles would be produced in 1912. So, last point I'll make is the transition in the industry from these hill climbs and endurance competitions to Jack Prince's expanded velodromes to motorcycle size, known as motordromes. It was in 1908, the same year that Curtis is kind of phasing himself out of the spotlight of motorcycles, that the game has changed, and Jack Prince begins erecting these circular wooden saucers big enough for motorcycles to compete on, which would become an absolute sensation, deadly though it may have been, for the next 6 years across America. This is known as the board track motordrome era, the first golden age of racing. And it is here where I will have to stop, open it up for questions if anybody happens to have them. And if you are interested in learning more about the motordromes, I do have a video on YouTube called Grit, where I dive into the history of the board track motordrome era. So let me see if I can find you guys. All right. So that is all I have for tonight. I think I'm quite out of time, but I am happy to stay and answer any questions if anyone may happen to have questions.